Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're reaching into the mailbox. Well, actually, we're opening up Facebook Messenger and receiving a message got from a friend. And it kind of boils down to where'd all the cat species come from. But it's much more than that. It's a question about what do creationists think, or how do they think that two cats on the ark could have given rise to 30 or 40 different species of cats. Well, those are the living cats. We also have to consider the 150 extinct species of cats. And just like, what would that have looked like if you were there watching cats give birth? Was a cat giving birth to like 3 different species at a time? Like, they have a litter of 10 and here's a lion and here's a panther and here's an Asian fishing cat. All right. All of them just coming out of the womb, like in one generation, or was that spread over a couple generations? And like, do we have any evidence that organisms change that fast? So more specifically, here's their actual question. What are young Earth creationist views on transitional species? How do we visualize the actual transitions between species? Actually, they would say that there are no transitional species, well, transitions between kinds, right? That one kind can't become another kind. And therefore, there are no transitions in the fossil record. However, they do believe that 2 kinds of cats or 2 individual dogs got off the ark and became dozens and dozens, if not more than 100 different species. The question really is, are there transitions between those species? And do we have evidence of those transitions? Do we have fossils of transitions between species within the same kind? What do they think happens when the ark animals evolve into actual modern species? The ark animals apparently didn't look like today's animals. They've evolved, they've changed, right? They've adapted to this new environment post-flood, right? If you're wondering what I'm talking about young Earth creationists, the perspective that the world is less than 7,000 years old, usually around 6,000 years old, and that only 4,500 years ago there was a global flood that wiped out all of the land vertebrate animals, except for the ones that were preserved on the ark. And that would have only been 2 of each kind of animal. And they take kind to be some kind of representative of a group of things that we would call species today. Now, lots of different definitions for a kind. And we'll kind of look at that in this particular talk. But I've talked about it many times before. So I'll give you the little short capsule view of that as we proceed. Back to the question here. Do they think that ark felines directly gave birth to lions, tigers, cheetahs, leopards, ocelots, house cats, etc., without any intermediates? And that's the question of transitional fossils. Do we see transitions? We're going to go to a fossil. Right, so what am I going to do to respond to this question? We're going to go to the Paleo Database, look at fossils, the records of fossils. We're going to think about the timing of when different types of cats have lived on Earth. We're going to look at the diversity of cats. We're going to look at maybe a little phylogeny of how cats are related to one another. We're going to look at young Earth creationist view of cats and their relationships. So it's kind of I have a hodgepodge of slides and different websites that we're going to just take a cruise over, that we're going to visit, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to start here, though. And this is something I actually do with my class. I have a number of pictures of cats. Wait a second. They're not actually all cats. So which one is not a member of the cat family? Which one of these is not a cat? Right? And you're like, well, so when you say cat, what are you talking about? I'm talking about the feline family, the Felidae, which would be the Latin term for the family of cats, things that we call felines. You think of your house cat, so you may be thinking lions and tigers and pumas, right? Fishing cats and what else are there? Sabertooth cats. If you think of the most famous extinct type of cat. But one of these, actually maybe 2 of these, are not actually classified as cats. That's interesting in itself. One of them is right down here. This is a linsang, right here, right? Not a cat. Take a close look at that animal, all right? You'd be forgiven if you would have lumped that in with the cats. Question is, what makes that not a cat? All right. And really, the question for creationists is how do they classify these things and say that this is a different kind of animal? All right. They would say that God created this kind of thing, and that everything else here, except one other, is the same thing. It's a different kind, right? The feline kind, the Felidae. And that includes all of them, including this one over here, which is some kind of saber-toothed cat, right? Which is included in the Felidae. It's an extinct cat. But this one up here, I believe, is a Nimridae. I got to look at the next slide to remember the Latin name for it. But the false saber-toothed cats, right? In which they kind of look like saber-toothed cats in their anatomy and so forth, but we think that they're not actually closely related, all right, to these other cats. They're not within this cat kind. And so that one there is actually in a separate family. And so young Earth creationists actually do place that in a separate kind of organism, which means in their estimation, God created that separately, whereas all these other things in this picture were all created with a common ancestor, and then they have diverged, right? They have evolved into all these spectacular varieties, all right, versions of cat-like things. All right, so in fact, I can show you, this is from a Young Earth Creationist website, this little circle diagram. And in it, this is what's called baraminology, in which they're trying to explain the origins of different types of groups and explain how they're in a nested hierarchy in a sense. I mean, they recognize that, that hyenas and mongooses and aardwolves and viverids, which include the linsangs, some of them, because there might be two different kinds or types of linsangs, and the palm civets and so forth, all have a lot of similarities to each other, right? So they're in a larger group, the Filiformia, right? And in the Filiformia, it's like a group, like just underneath the order, because the order is carnivore, like they're all carnivores. And this is one group of carnivores, which are the cat-like carnivores. You also have the Caniformi, which are like the dog-like carnivores. They're not all dogs, right? There's a dog group, but there's bears and there's other things that are dog-like, including even seals. And so then they would say, like, well, if you look at these family names, so for example, if you look at some of these families, here's the Felidae. Here's the one we're talking about. I mean, this is the original question is, where did all the cats come from, right? And so they would acknowledge, young Earth creationists generally, all right, would acknowledge the Felidae as a natural group, that they're all actually related to one another, that they have a common ancestor. In other words, God created some kind of cat-like thing, and it evolved into, after the Noah's flood, into all the different kinds of things that are members of the Felidae today, which they would agree with secular scientists in terms of what they lump together in the Felidae and say, like, yes, all those things are related to one another. But then you have the Asiatic linsangs, which are in a different family. That's a separately created kind of animal. And they're in the Felidae, which has other families which have very similar characteristics to cats. And then more broadly, the Viveroidae, right, and the Viveridae. These are all viverids, by the way, over here, right? All these things right here, these are all members of another family. I don't know. Don't look at that very long, because you're sort of like, sometimes they may look a little bit like a badger or, something like that, but a raccoon or something like that. But some of them also have very cat-like characteristics as well. Or you could say like they have mongoose-like characteristics. Well, they're very similar to the group that includes the mongooses. Right. And then you have the hyenas. There's a whole bunch of different hyenas. There's not very many hyenas species alive today, but there have been in the past a lot of different hyenas. And hyenas also have cat-like characteristics, which is why they're in this larger category called the Filiformia. And then you have the palm civets. And then what I want you to notice up there in the corner is you've got the false saber-toothed cats in Nimrividi. And they're outside. In other words, they're more different than all these other cats. I mean, basically the reason they're placed in this outer group is, and they remember this is a young Earth creationist sort of envisioning of how similar these different groups are to each other. Even though they're not actually related by common ancestry, they say like, yes, but they still share common designs or characteristics. But they recognize that the false saber-toothed cats are in a group that's sort of outside of the mongooses and the viverids and the cats and the ling-sangs and the palm civets. Those are all more similar to each other. And then you have the false saber-toothed cats. Except, I mean, saber-toothed cats look a whole lot like large cats, right? But they have some other anatomical features that have been recognized by scientists to place them into a separate group. All right, so the upshot of all this is there is lots of variety in things that have cat-like features. And then you have subgroups that have like specific distinct characteristics, like cats have retractable claws. And there's a few other things that sort of unify all felidae with each other. But nonetheless, there's not that huge of a difference between some of these groups. I would imagine there's probably some young Earth creationists who would be willing to clap some of these together and say like the Linsangs, which is like that picture on the previous slide, sure look like an awful lot like a cat just from external appearances. Maybe they just want to lump them together. You have your lumpers and you have your splitters among young Earth creationists, just like you do among taxonomists. Who will either decide to put things together in a species or maybe break species apart into separate species. All right, so now let's think about the young Earth creationist model a little bit of the origin of species. How do we get biological diversity from a young Earth perspective? And this image on the left is an image from Answers in Genesis, leading young Earth creationist apologetics ministry, all right, who are promoting young Earth creationism. And they are promoting this idea that that animals on the ark were, there was sort of like a basic ark kind that was preserved from the original creation. And then after they stepped off the ark into this new barren world, they then diversified into all the different animals we have today. In other words, super speed, hyper evolution occurred after that. And that's shown in this picture. You have like this original created kind, which then is preserved on the ark. And then after the ark then splits into your house cat and your lions and your cheetahs and your jaguars. And so the original created kind must have had in it all the genetic information it needed to make all those other things, right? So they call it like, created heterozygosity. They had lots of different variants of different alleles, gene variants. And then they got sort of divided into different sort of types of cats at this point. That we would recognize and look today at and say like, oh, that's a species, right? You have the African lion, right? You get the cheetah, right? The puma, right? And we'd say like, those are different species, even though there's maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands sometimes of individuals that all have very similar characteristics. Like all together, that's one species, different and isolated from other species. Well, how did they get to that point? I mean, they started as just two individuals on the ark. Those two individuals. Oh, and then this picture on the right is an image from the Ark Encounter. All right. Ken Ham's like image of his representation of what the ark might have been like, that Noah's Ark. And then he has animals on that Noah's Ark that represent the ark kinds. And so here's the ark kind of the felids, the cat kind, right? And it's kind of this nondescript, kind of has like some features of a number of different cats kind of amalgamated together. And it's actually kind of based on the fossil record of some of the earliest known cats from the deepest part of the fossil record. And then you can see above this cat, it's got African wildcat, domesticated cats, servals, cheetahs, lions, ocelots, clouded leopards, smilodon, which is the saber-toothed cat. And there were many, many different species of those, just like there are species of lynxes and species of lions and so forth. And so there's a lot of diversity. And they show all these little, I don't know if you can see this very well, but there's little lines going up to each one. It's kind of like you got this original cat right here. And it then becomes all these things, right? Becomes all these different types of things. Well, how did that happen? How did that happen? And the hand wavy, and it truly is to me a very hand wavy explanation, is that there's two cats. They then, and the usual presentation by like somebody like Ken Ham would be like, well, you got two canines. I'll use his actual example. You have two canines and they mated, on the ark or right after they got off the ark. And then they had a litter. And the litter, because there was so much variation between the two parents, they had a litter and some of the puppies had long hair and some had short hair. And as they traveled maybe north, right? So this particular pair of the original pair traveled a little bit north. They had offspring. Those offspring then had some variation in them. Shaggy hair, short hair. And then because they traveled up to the Himalayas first, and it was wintertime, the ones with the longer hair would have survived better. The ones with the shorter hair, not so much. So maybe the ones with longer hair mated with each other. They would have to mate with their sister or brother. And then they had more offspring that had long hair. But there would have been some variation, but they're living in a cold climate. And so the longer hair gets selected for. It's natural selection, right? The environment is selecting for the variations in the traits. Well, okay. So where did the other dogs that have short hair, other species that have shorter hair, come from? Well, maybe that original family, had a litter of 10, and then that litter of 10 had 5 of them went off north and 5 went south. And out of the 5 that went north, a couple of them had long hair, a couple of them had short hair. The longer hair ones survived better. The ones that stayed in the desert, the ones that had longer hair did worse, and the ones that had short hair did better. And therefore, the next generation, you would have more short-haired ones in the desert and more long-haired ones in the Alps or whatever. Right. So that's the sort of like, hey, that's what would happen. They had variation and the variation got selected. And eventually you had different types of dogs, which we recognize today as being different species. So you ended up with foxes and you ended up with wolves and you ended up with coyotes, right? You ended up with African wild dogs, and they had spots, which were different than the ones that went north, right? And so all this variation somehow got sorted out. But this necessitates, in a way, that those original generations had fantastically wild amounts of variation. I mean, that you would have had a dog that would have, had offspring, right? And as a litter of 10, and there's basically an African wild dog and a fox, right? A gray fox, like completely different looking canines that come out of that particular combination. And they apparently all were able to mate with each other, even though today most of them don't mate very well with one another. They either can't or they're very limited in their ability to, or have a lack of success in doing so. All right, so that's, you might be saying to yourself, okay. I mean, if you're younger, creationists, let's say, sure, why not? I mean, we can see that we can select and make lots of different dog breeds very quickly. But I got to remind you, that's our selection, as very strong selection, and nature really doesn't select that strongly for characteristics. And the problem with Ken Ham's thing is he's really only talking about one characteristic. Organisms, different cats, have hundreds of thousands of different variants, right, that make a lion different than a cheetah. And so to sort out those 100,000 variants that make up the lion versus the cheetah is not something that's going to happen in one generation, right? You can have an offspring that has, would have like long legs and a short tail and, a mane, but not something else. And another one has spots. Another one, it's going to be a characteristic. It's going to be a hodgepodge of dozens of different characteristics, many of which are not well adapted to any particular environment, right? Their coat color, if you have shorter back legs, because there are cats that have like longer back legs versus shorter ones, depending on how much they need to jump or whether they're climbing or so forth. If you combine these features with features that like this works well for this environment, but this is a terrible characteristic for this environment, you can have all kinds of crazy variations of organisms with mismatched characteristics. They don't really look well adapted for their environment. By the way, this is not what the fossil record looks like. when we look at the environment that organisms are found in, right, and their diet or whatever, and all those types of things, we find that most species, just like today, you look around, species are adapted to their particular environment quite well. They're not like, have completely misfit characteristics. And in the natural selection model of just, hey, there's variation and it gets scrambled randomly and it creates hundreds of different variants, right? Because if there's 34 different cat species, and really there's 100 other extinct species, like all the saber-toothed cats, and, like one of their offspring has saber teeth and two of them don't, right? But they're living in an environment where the parents like trying to help them catch a certain kind of prey, which saber-tooth or what is adapted to eating that particular prey. Well, I mean, it's just, they're going to have very unsuccessful offspring. All right. So just extraordinarily poor adaptation as a result of having too much variation that is in combinations that really don't work. And that's why no evolutionary biologist would say like that change is going to happen that quickly, or that there could possibly be that much variation within one species, especially within two individuals that are going to reproduce. Now what I want to do is, we're going to think through that scenario a little bit more. Like, what would that actually look like moving out into the environment? Because you're starting in the Middle East, and then you have two cats, and then they have a litter, and do they all look different? And then how do they know where to go in terms of the environment they're fit for? I'm sure there are some creationists, maybe like ICR, who believes that maybe the cats just knew, like, I'm terribly fit for this environment, so I've just got to head to the environment where I'm fit. Like they somehow have some kind of, directional, signal in them that says like, I'm a misfit for this, so I'm going to move to the environment that I'm fit for, versus the environment selecting upon the variation there and saying, these are the organisms that best fit here. All right, so I just want to show you a little more variation. Then we're going to go to a couple of websites and I'll be able to make my point when I get to the fossil stuff. This is a quick phylogeny showing a bunch of different saber-toothed cats, right? And on this figure, these right here, panther and lynx, these two lines right here, this represents all of the living, this represents all the living cats today. Right? They're all very similar to each other, but we have lots and lots and lots and lots of other things that are considered in the Felidae, right? The same family. But these are a whole bunch of other different varieties. And I'm going to show you Dinofelis. Felis is the name of like Felix, the cat, right? The Felis is the genus that your common house cat is in. But there's something called Dinofelis. Felis. And I want to show you fossils from that. Now, I only ran across Dinofelis because I was on the Paleo database. And I was just randomly clicking on different kinds of cat fossils. And the first one that popped up from Africa was this Dinofelis. I'd never heard of it before, so I looked up some information about it and found this paper. First small-sized Dinofelis, evidence from the Pleistocene of North Africa. Whole bunch of authors in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews. And the important thing we have here is there's the location way out here in the desert in Morocco. And what I found interesting is this is the site that it was found at. So they're just digging down into the side of this hill, not terribly steep hill. And you can see the multiple layers of rock, and underneath about 3 meters, like 9 feet of rock here, there's a layer there in which you see, here's a jawbone of a cat, a number of other bones. And that makes up, here's the bones here. And that makes up Dinofelis, right? And they describe this fossil. It's a cat type thing. It's not exactly a saber-toothed cat, but it's related to the other saber-toothed cats. And it's found out here in this dry, barren, forbidding area. And underneath rock, right? And they date it to a couple million years ago. Now, in the young Earth creationist scenario, when did this cat live? Well, almost every young Earth creationist places all the rock below this area, in the flood. They say the flood caused that. But this particular rock is right at the very top, and it's in the layers of sediment that most young Earth creationists would say is post-flood, right? It's just the result of events that occurred after the floodwaters receded, and most importantly, after the animals got off the ark. And then they start to spread across the world, and then they die and get preserved in some of the upper sediments that are being laid down in post-flood catastrophes, specifically things like the ice age that occurs after the global flood in the young Earth creationist model. And so they would say that, well, this occurred sometime, this cat thing had to have occurred after the flood. After all the cat fossils are in the top 15 million years in terms of like the true cats. I mean, if you go out and look at like the deeper, older things that are cat-like, they kind of fit in those larger circles. All right, those go down to 20 million years ago. But almost all young Earth creationists see the top 20 million years worth of rock that's dated to 20 million years. They don't really believe it's 20 million years, but they believe it's less than 4,500 years old. It's post-flood. So all of that rock that contains all these fossils, well, that contains fossils of organisms that came from the ark. So they had to get off the ark and come to this part of North Africa. They had to die here and get covered up by sediments. Now, the thing is, we know that this particular area, there's rock art not far from here that is in stone, implements and things like that, that's on the surface here, meaning this is a really old surface. In the young Earth creationist model, the Stone Age is just the first couple hundred years after the flood, before people rediscovered technology. But that's laying on the surface here. And you have rock art, which is very primitive rock art. And that's not very far away from here either, basically on the surface rocks, right? And yet this particular site is underneath several layers of rock and sediment then. So when did these cats live here? In the young Earth creationist model, they have to have occurred sometime immediately after the flood, and prior to the ice age, because in order to explain the sediments that are on top of them, especially some of the sediments that show that this area was greener and more habitable, which makes sense because there's a lot of different cat species that are preserved in this area, along with all kinds of other animals that you wouldn't expect in the middle of this desert. Cats maybe, but there's a bunch of other types of vertebrates who are in the rocks, in the upper layers of the rocks here, which don't fit with its present environment. And yet we know this present environment has existed here for thousands of years. I would say tens of thousands of years, but for young Earth creationists, they're going to say like at least 4,000 years, because it's only after the ice age, and the ice age would have been when this area was green, right? And immediately after that, it turned into a desert, which means these cats had to get here before that point. Now you're wondering like, okay, what's your point? I just said before that point. What about my point? What is the point I'm trying to make by showing you all these things? I have a really simple point here. It's very simple. This cat is distinguishable as a unique character. It has unique characteristics which set it apart as a species. And there are multiple other species of fossil versions of this particular genus, this group. They're distinguishable, all right? And there's multiple members of these species. And when you have multiple members of the species, they're all very similar to one another. And they're all buried or in rocks that are pre-ice age. In the young Earth creationist model, they have to be before the ice age. So that means, and the ice age came like just a couple hundred years after the flood. Just a couple hundred years. So you had two cats on the ark. They got off. They had offspring. Those offspring had to, wander away from the Middle East region, get over the Nile River somehow, all right, and then come to this region. And then there's actually lions and some type of cheetah, a type of panther, and there's this Dinophilos, and there's another saber-toothed cat. There's probably like 20 different species of cats that are known from the fossil record in this area in North Africa. And they're all pre-Ice Age, right? Based on the chronology of young Earth creationists. So they've already diversified. They've already turned into distinguishable, separate species, for which many are in populations of similar individuals. So they've sorted their genes out to the point where they're all kind of similar to each other. Like cheetahs are all similar to each other, and African lions have a lot of similarities to each other. When two mate, they have more African lions, and when two cheetahs mate, they have more cheetahs. Right? They're not just popping out completely different species every generation. Where did all these come from? Where are the transitional fossils? So real quick, let me show you some of the variation in the Felidae. So in the Felidae, which is this genus, and I said there's lots of extinct things. So here you have each one of these is a different species. There's sort of like, there's groups of species that are similar, just like there are large cats that are similar to each other, and there's smaller cats that are similar to each other today that we put into groups. And all of these are extinct. And some of these are Tyrannosaurus, Sabertooth type cats. And other ones are just other kinds of cats that are kind of similar to ones today. But all the living ones are in the Flineae or in the Pantherae. All right. Those are your large cats. And these are your smaller cats, right? Those are your two groups of living cats we have today, of which there's 35 to 40 species. I can't remember the exact number. There's another group of ones that are considered to be very similar to both of these, and they're all extinct. And then there is another group that's extinct. A bunch of other groups are extinct. So you get this idea. There's a whole bunch of different sort of types of cats, and each one of these are different enough from each other that they're more different from each other than the types of cats that are alive today. So if you think about the variety of cats we have today, you have to really expand your imagination to imagine like what all the diversity of all the cats that we consider to be in the Felidae. And then down here are all the actual living cats, right? So you have the panther lineage, the ocelots, the bay cat lineage, the lynxes, the pumas, right? The leopards, and domesticated cats and their similar species that are wild. All right, so those are all your living cats. And as I said before, all those living cats are just contained in these two little groups up here. So now backing up, if all of these, and young Earth creationists do consider all of these to be part of the same family, so the same kind, which means if you go right back to the beginning, this line right down here represents the original, right, common ancestor that gave rise to all these. So that common ancestor would be the arc kind. And then after getting off the ark, they had to divide into all of these different species. And we're not even showing all the species up here. There's actually a lot more species than this. It's just a sampling of them. So, and all of these extinct ones, every one of these, which is in a location where you can identify how the ice age affected that region, is underneath the ice age. Okay? The fossils come before the last ice age. In conventional dating, these fossils are anywhere from 500,000, really 1 million or more, all the way down to like 5 and 6 million years old. Actually, some of these are more like 10 million years old. Some of the really old ones. So clearly they would be before the last ice age. But even in what I'm saying is, even in the young Earth creationist model, all of these are before the last ice age. And there's ones in North America. There's ones in South America. There's ones in Africa, right? Northern Africa, Southern Africa, in Asia. They're all over the place before the last ice age. So cats got off the ark, somehow dispersed throughout the entire world into separate species, which are adapted for their local situations. And in some cases, in large numbers. There are saber-toothed cats for which we have hundreds of samples of individual species, and they're very uniform. It was like having 100 copies of African lions and saying, yeah, there's some variation there, but they're all very similar to one another. In other words, they had to get to North America. They had to be a separate species, and they also had to copy themselves and not turn into a bunch of other things, right? They had to all be consistent and make a population of the same thing. That takes generations as well. What we don't see in the fossil record is we don't see like that thing like changing so that there's like 50 different varieties in the same area. Like every individual that was born is totally different than another one because there's so much genetic variation. Okay, let's bring this point home. I'm at the Paleobiology Database Navigator, and what we're going to do is we're going to look at, this is a giant database of indexed fossils that have been curated to some degree of confidence, right? There's lots of fossils that have been found that haven't been put into this database yet, but this includes millions and millions and millions of fossils, include their location and their dates, all right, how old they are. I'm sorry, it's a lot of fossils covering a lot of time, but we can narrow this down. We can just look at the Felidae. I say, good, that's what I want to look at. I want to look at all the different collections of those. And so I see lots and lots of different yellow dots. I don't see any blue dots. I don't see any green dots. All right, it's all yellow. Yellow represents Cenozoic. And so for those who don't know your geological timetable, the Mesozoic is the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, which is your age of the dinosaurs, right? Running from 270 million years all the way up to 65 million years ago or 66 million years ago. And this boundary right here between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene that's where the asteroid impact is. And then after that, we have the Cenozoic, and we live in the Cenozoic right now. And so the Cenozoic is yellow. All of these dots are yellow. There is the subgroups. Actually, let's click on the Cenozoic. We can get rid of all the rest of time before 65 million years. In other words, one of the take homes here is there are no fossils of cats. Anything that's been recognized as a cat of any form, right? None are known before the 65 million year mark. But there aren't even any known in the, if I click on the Paleogene, right? The Paleogene runs all the way up to 23 million years, right? And all the way back to 65. There are a couple dots here. They're not many, right? And they're in the Oligocene at the very end of the Oligocene. Let's just check that. Oh, there's one in the Rupellian. That one's broader Cenozoic. All right, so that's 33 million or less. So we could say from this map, from this accounting of a very large data set, they do not have any cats from before 33 million years ago. And I suspect in the Rupellian, it's probably the late Rupellian. Right, so the very first things that even have the hint of being cat-like don't even show up until the 20s millions of years ago, right, in the Oligocene. And now I got to scroll over here. Let's zoom in a little bit more. And now let's look at the Neogene. Oh, okay. Well, now the Neogene, and then, of course, the Quaternary, which is the present period, right? There's lots and lots and lots of dots. We can zoom in. Look at this. I mean, these are all fossil locations, right? Here we have Morocco, got some fossil locations there. North America, lots and lots of fossils of these things. And that's in the Neogene. The Neogene goes up to, what we got here, 2.58 million. All right, so every one of these fossils, let me just scan across here. All these fossils, if you were to investigate where they were found, you would find likely very good evidence that they're all underneath or before the last ice age. There's actually been many, many ice ages over the last couple of million years. But in the young Earth creationist model, all of these are pre-ice age. So that means there were all these different cats down here. There are a few cats in South America, not so many. And then lots of cats in North America, right? We can come back around to Europe or Asia, lots of cats there. None in Australia, which makes sense, right? Because we didn't bring placentals there until much, much later human beings brought them there. All right. So again, I'm going to reiterate this point. All this diversity of cats, which represents, and I'm not going to click on every one of them here now, but I know that it represents, oh, I think we can do it. Here we go. Genera sampled at this stage. Genera. Remember, a genus is like Felis, and there's like 8 different species of Felis alive today. And then there's the leopards, all right? And that's a different genus, and there's multiple different species of leopards. And so genus represents a more distinct groups from each other than just species are. And so you see in the Neogene, right before the Neogene, the Paleogene, right, there's one genus. Right, and then in the Neogene, right, covering 20 million years, we have in the fossil record, we have an increase from 5 to 10 to 15 to 20 genera. So massive different genera occurring. That would be different kinds of saber-toothed cats, and you have other ones that are totally extinct groups of cats today. And then there's actually a loss of diversity of genera, like multiple different types of saber-tooths. And then down into the quaternary, and we're in the quaternary, and there's just 6 or 7 genera left at present. So most of the diversity of cats that are distinguishable species and genera are pre-Ice Age. So cats the 2 cats that got off the ark had to get real busy real fast and produce a lot of offspring, and essentially every offspring had to become a different species of cat. But to maintain their continuity as a species, they would have to mate with other ones that are very similar and had the same genetic profile. But if there's so much diversity, they should have been like constantly mixing that thing and making all kinds of wild variations. What we see is over a million years, there's a cat that gradually changes from one kind to another, one species to another, over a process by which the entire population is gradually changing as it's adapting to its environment. And so you see multiple individuals that all have the similar characteristics, and they gradually change until they become a different species over time. That takes tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years for those kind of changes to occur. We would expect a much more varied fossil record were these all individually different from each other. As I said before, if you go to North America, I don't know how easily I'll be able to do this, and you look at Bakersfield, LA. I'm just going to pick one out. Kent's Quarry. What is there? Occurrences. There is a member of the Felidae. It's Pseudolurus. Let's get rid of Neogene and let's see where. Oh, that particular genus, Pseudolurus. I don't know. I don't know what that is. I don't know that particular genus. As I said, there's a bunch of different genus. It's obviously an extinct genus. Wow. All right. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of different records of them. And it's just saying that genus. But at the same time, there's multiple other genera in North America. That wasn't all the dots. There was a lot more dots in the in the Neogene. We're not looking at the quaternary. We're actually looking at the Neogene. And then in the quaternary, all of these different genera disappear, and there's different genera, and there's different species, right, that replace them over time. Well, let's just pick one more. Let's go farther away and say, let's go up here in Nebraska. Actually, I think I know where this is right here. That's why I'm going to pick that one out. No, it's not the site I thought it was. Occurrences. Yeah, so there is a Pseudolurus species here. What they're saying is we don't have enough material to be able to tell whether it's a different species, but we can tell it's part of this genus. All right, doing a quick search here, and we're going to look at the Wikipedia page for this. Prehistoric cat that lived in Europe, Asia, and North America in the Miocene 20 to 8 million years ago. So 8 million years ago went extinct. Yeah, look at that. This particular genus all over the place. That's another thing. You'd have to keep that how do you keep that consistency of like it's in that genus across that whole area when there's many, many other genera? So that's the other thing. There's a hierarchy here. There's a nested hierarchy. And so you'd have to have two cats get off the ark. They have to give rise to a few offspring, and each offspring basically has to become a different genus. And then each of those genera have to give rise to many individuals that stay in the same genus, stay similar enough to be recognized as in that genus. And then they had to migrate across the whole world. This particular genus migrated across many different continents. And another member of the family that was a different species had to somehow have enough offspring. I don't know how you get together with another one which is different or the same. How do you get two that are the same when you're so different genetically at the beginning, to create a common genera which had to also disperse across the whole world but not mate with each other, because if they mated with each other it would get so mixed together we wouldn't be able to recognize very clearly different genera in multiple different places, right? I mean, creationists might want to make a big deal about how they're compatible, like all cats are semi-compatible. They're not actually all compatible with each other, but many of them can be forced to mate and produce offspring. But the offspring are often completely unable to survive well in their particular environment, because they're not adapted to any particular environment, right? They have a mixture of characteristics. And they also, so they might not have very good survivability. They might not be able to attract a mate, right? Because maybe their mating call or their behaviors are different. They're a mixture of behaviors between two species. And as a result, they can't attract any other member of that species. And there's no one else like them because they're a hybrid. And so they're going to have difficulty finding a mate. So just because two individuals can mate doesn't mean that it's going to mix the genetics of those populations and those species. They're still going to remain isolated from each other if they're not mating consistently with each other. And that's what we see with 100 different species of cats that have lived just in the last couple million years, or just since Noah's flood. They maintain their genetic consistency across even continents. That's not something that just you get overnight. And all of these pre-Ice Age. By the Ice Age, they're gone. All right? They're gone extinct already. That's only 300 years, maybe. 300 years. You know, if they live 10 years and they have offspring after 2 years, sure, every 2 years they can have offspring. But even in the best of worlds, if they have 5 offspring and then they have 5 more offspring and 5 more offspring, yeah, sure, you could make a lot of cats. But of course, they're also being, they're going to succumb to disasters and diseases and other things too. So they're not all going to be successful, especially when you're mixing up a bunch of crazy genes and creating non-optimal varieties all the time. So that's interesting. I did not know about that particular cat. Where does it fall out here? Oh, there's this genus right here. The Pseudolurus lineage. And what's it characterized by? Up to 66 pounds, pretty big, approximately the size of a cougar. All right, back to our chart. So I'm going to get rid of that, bring back the Felidae. All right, so bottom line, lots of different species, lots of different genera of cats that suddenly are there, right? After the flood and before the Ice Age. And this is true for most mammalian lineages. So young Earth creationists really do have to propose some kind of hyperspeed evolution. They have to propose that they are rapidly reproducing, like as fast as they can. Of course, they're going to have resources to do so. Cats are going to have to going to have to catch a lot of rabbits, right? And a lot of other things. And as they go into different habitats, what if their prey hasn't even made it to that habitat? Because the prey also has to be migrating. The prey also has to be speciating. And how can it speciate if it's being constantly preyed upon and none of them survive? But anyway, the cats have to move out and they have to basically conquer the world, and 100 different recognizable species have to have formed within the space of a couple hundred years, and then they all go extinct. All right? Mass extinction happens because they're not present in post-ice age material. In fact, they're not really even in ice age material. They're in pre-ice age material. That's a lot of reproduction. That's a lot of diversification. That is speciation that would make an evolutionary biologist head spin in terms of the rapidity of that. All right. Now that doesn't even begin to tackle the issue of how these cats are related to hyenas and linsangs and mongooses and the false sabertooth cats, which is a whole different lineage, which also had to leave the ark. And I've looked up that particular family, and there's like dozens and dozens of species of those all over the world. So all of them would be competing with this other group of cats as well. And that's the other thing about this is, like, if you have 25 million years, we're not saying all these cats, these 100 other species of cats that are extinct, all were alive at one time. No, it's like there was like a couple in North America. You know, you had a large cat, you had a small cat, you had like a cougar-like cat, you had a large panther-like cat, right? And maybe you have a saber-tooth cat. And then they evolve and change into one or two other species each as one goes extinct and the one arises, or one splits into two, and maybe one goes extinct eventually. And so eventually there's 3 other types of species for a million or 2 years. And then a million or 2 there, you see there's a couple other species, you know, and a new genus moves in. Right. So over time, we're not saying there's like 20, because when you add it up, North America has had like 40 different species of cats in the fossil record. If they were all alive at the same time and they're across multiple different states, which means they're in population numbers that are pretty big for us to actually have preserved enough of them for us to find them, means there had to have been a lot of them over some period of time. It means North America was overrun with cats in a young Earth creationist model. They were just everywhere, multiple different species within, you know, close proximity to each other. That doesn't make sense ecologically, right? Even the youngest, if they're going to claim that they quickly adapted and natural selection just adapted them within a generation or two and select for like a good version that works in this particular environment, you'd only end up with a couple species. You wouldn't end up with that many different species, which are distinct from each other and not apparently hybridizing. Otherwise, we'd find more examples of hybrid versions of fossils between these different genera and kinds of cats. All right, been talking for a long time. Yeah, I don't know how to wrap this up. I just stay right here and say, you know, this is not unusual. We could do the same thing with cats. I'm sorry, with dogs. We could do the same story with bears, right? We could do the same story with primates. We could do the same story certainly with rats and so forth. I think one of the best ones is elephants. There's well over 100 different species of elephants. And like Dinotherium, which is the elephant that has the tusks that bend down, there's thousands of samples of Dinotherium that have been found all over Africa, a little bit up into Asia. So there were huge herds of those, enormous numbers, and multiple different species over time. But in the young Earth creationist model, they all had to have existed before the ice age, but after the flood. And elephants are a little bit more difficult because they, you know, it takes 10 or 15 years, you know, to make another elephant. And so if you only have 300 years and you have to make 50 different species, and some of those species might have had millions of members, it's like, how do you even copy that many elephants that fast? Much less they have to adapt to different locations and different environments and different food sources. And they have to get all the way from the Ark all the way to South America, because there are multiple species of elephants in South America, multiple species of elephants in North America, large numbers, huge numbers of elephants in North America. So they had to get here, they had to grow into huge numbers, and they all had to go extinct within a couple hundred years. Because I don't know of any elephant sample in North America that's not preserved in a place that is not, that's post-flood, post-ice age, right? They look like they're in ice age or pre-ice age sediments. That's an incredible challenge. All right, let's stop it there. Hey, thanks for listening. Honestly, yeah, and thanks for the question. I appreciate it. This was fun to talk about. It's kind of fun to learn a little bit more about cats. I'm not really a cat person. I know a little bit more of the dog species and dog varieties than I do the cats. All right, till next time. We'll see ya when we see ya.